Picture this: a man who never traveled more than 10 miles from his birthplace. A philosopher so punctual that townspeople set their clocks by his daily walks. A thinker who lived in a single provincial city yet whose ideas would shake the foundations of human thought, influence revolutions across continents, and shape the very concept of human rights that we hold dear today. This is the story of Immanuel Kant, a man whose life was bounded by the city walls of Königsberg but whose mind ranged across the infinite expanse of human knowledge, from the mechanics of the cosmos to the deepest questions of morality and freedom. Before we begin this extraordinary journey through the life and ideas of one of history's greatest minds, I want to invite you to join our community of curious learners. If you find value in these deep explorations of history's most fascinating thinkers, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Your support makes it possible for us to continue creating these detailed, thoughtful narratives that bring the past to life. Now, let us step back in time to the 18th century, to a world of cobblestone streets, harness makers' workshops, and the first stirrings of the Enlightenment, a world that would produce a philosophical revolution as profound as any political uprising. The Baltic Sea in the 18th century presented a vista of gray-green waters lapping against the docks of Königsberg, a city perched on the edge of East Prussia where three smaller towns had merged into one. The year was 1724, and the scent of salt mingled with the smell of leather and harness oil, with the aroma of fresh bread baking in ovens, with the earthy perfume of spring rain on cobblestones. It was here, in this convergence of trade routes and cultures, of German discipline and Baltic mystery, that our story begins. On the 22nd of April, in the early morning hours when the world was still wrapped in the grey gauze of dawn, a child entered the world. His father, Johann Georg Kant, a master harness maker whose hands were calloused from years of working leather, took up his pen and wrote in the family diary with trembling fingers, "On Saturday the 22nd of April at 5 in the morning, my son Immanuel came into this world. Lord, grant him grace till the blessed end of his life. May the blessing of Jesus Christ be with him." The ink dried slowly on the page, and in that moment, neither the father nor anyone else could have imagined that this infant, the fourth child born into a family of modest means, would one day be counted among the greatest minds humanity has ever produced. The house where Immanuel Kant was born stood in the Vorder of Vorstadt, the forward suburb between the Green Bridge and the Friedrichsburg fortress. It was a modest dwelling, the kind where the scent of leather from the workshop below would drift up through the floorboards, where the sounds of hammers on anvils and needles through tough hide created a constant rhythm of industry. The walls were thick, built to withstand the Baltic winters when the wind would howl across the frozen Pregel River and ice would form in intricate crystal patterns on the window panes. In summer, those same windows would be thrown open to let in the amber light that seemed to glow with particular warmth in this part of the world, as if the famous Baltic amber had lent something of its honeyed luminescence to the very air itself. Johann Georg Kant was not originally from Königsberg. He had come from Memel, Prussia's most northeastern city, now known as Klaipėda in Lithuania, bringing with him the skills of a harness maker and the determination of a man seeking to make his way in the world. In 1715 he had married Anna Regina Reuter, and this marriage had been more than a union of hearts. It had been an economic necessity, a doorway into the guild system that controlled the artisan trades of Königsberg. Anna Regina's father was also a harness maker, a master craftsman whose membership in the guild would allow Johann Georg to practice his trade legally in the city. Without this connection, without this carefully arranged marriage that nevertheless bloomed into genuine affection, Johann Georg would have remained forever an outsider, unable to hang his shingle or sell his wares. But let us speak of Anna Regina, for she is perhaps the most important figure in the early formation of Immanuel Kant's character, more important even than all the philosophy professors he would later study under, more important than all the books he would later devour. She was born in 1697 in Königsberg, the daughter of Johann Reuter from Nuremberg. She was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman for her time, better educated than most women of the 18th century, able to read and write with facility, capable of managing the family's accounts and paperwork, which she did with quiet competence while her husband worked at his trade. Anna Regina was a pietist, a follower of that austere and intense branch of Lutheran faith that had swept through Protestant Germany in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Pietism was not merely a set of beliefs, it was a way of life, a constant examination of one's soul, a relentless pursuit of moral purity and direct communion with the divine. It stressed simplicity in worship, humility in bearing, and above all, the literal interpretation of Scripture combined with the imperative to live out its teachings in every moment of every day. The Pietists believed that true faith was not a matter of grand theological debates or elaborate church ceremonies, but rather a quiet, internal burning, a constant awareness of God's presence and a perpetual striving to align one's actions with His will. Imagine a young mother in the 1720s, her hair covered modestly with a cap, her dress simple and unadorned, walking along the banks of the Pregel River with her children in tow. This was Anna Regina Kant, and among the children clinging to her skirts was young Immanuel, his eyes wide and curious, taking in everything around him with an intensity that his mother noticed and nurtured. They would walk along the Philosophy Dam, an embankment with a footpath that wound through the water meadows where wildflowers grew in profusion during the spring and summer months. The air would be filled with the calls of waterfowl, the rustle of reeds in the breeze, and Anna Regina's gentle voice as she pointed out the different plants and birds they encountered. She would bend down to show little Immanuel the intricate structure of a flower, explaining how each part had its purpose, how the petals attracted the bees, how the bees in turn carried pollen from one flower to another. She would point to the sky and name the different types of clouds, explaining how some brought rain and others promised fair weather. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the family gathered together, Anna Regina would lead her children outside to look at the stars. The night sky over Königsberg, far from the light pollution that would plague later centuries, was a revelation, a vast expanse of silver points pricked into the deep velvet of darkness. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and Anna Regina would tell her children that they were looking at the handiwork of God, at the grand design that spoke of a Creator's love and wisdom. These moments, these simple expeditions into nature with his mother, would stay with Immanuel Kant for his entire life. Decades later, in one of his most famous passages, he would write, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the oftener and the more steadily we reflect on them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." The starry heavens, those were the same stars he had gazed at as a child, holding his mother's hand in the Königsberg twilight. The moral law, that was the sense of right and wrong that Anna Regina had so carefully cultivated in her son, not through harsh punishment or frightening threats, but through patient explanation and personal example. Anna Regina read the gospel to her children, but not in the dry, perfunctory manner that might have been expected. She brought the stories to life, explaining the meaning of Christ's commandments in language that children could understand, showing them how the teachings could be applied to their own lives. When Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself, Anna Regina explained what this meant in practical terms, sharing with those who had less, speaking kindly even when angry, forgiving those who had wronged you. She instilled in Immanuel what his later biographers would describe as the first germ of goodness, opening his heart to the impressions of nature and awakening in him concepts that would later blossom into a complete ethical system. Kant himself would later say, "I will never forget my mother, for she implanted and nurtured in me the first germ of goodness. She opened my heart to the impressions of nature, she awakened and furthered my concepts, and her doctrines have had a continual and beneficial influence in my life." These are remarkable words from a man not known for sentimentality, from a philosopher who built his entire system on reason rather than emotion. They speak to the profound impact that Anna Regina had on her son, to the way her genuine religiosity, as Kant later described it, blended love, tolerance and spirituality into a faith that was neither fanatical nor hypocritical, but rather deeply felt and consistently lived. The Kant household was a place of industry and discipline, but also of warmth and mutual respect. Johann Georg and Anna Regina, though not wealthy, maintained their dignity and independence. They never fell into debt, a point of pride in a world where many craftsmen were perpetually in hock to moneylenders and merchants. They worked hard, lived modestly, and raised their children with a combination of pietist moral strictness and genuine parental affection. Immanuel was the fourth of 9 children, though as was tragically common in the 18th century, only 4 of his siblings would survive to adulthood. The specter of childhood mortality hung over every family, and one can imagine Anna Regina's prayers, her desperate hope that each of her babies would live, would grow, would thrive. In 1729, when Immanuel was 5 years old, a significant change came to the family's circumstances. His maternal grandfather, the master harness maker whose guild membership had been so crucial to Johann Georg's ability to work in Königsberg, died on the 1st of March. This death left Anna Regina's mother, Regina Reuter, without a provider, and it also left the downtown harness shop without its master. The solution, as was often the case in those days, was for the family to consolidate. The Kants moved from their modest home in the Vorder of Vorstadt to the house of Anna Regina's mother on the Sadlerstrasse, the Sadler Street, in a less prosperous part of the city. This move, while economically necessary, proved to be a difficult transition. The Saddlerstrasse was in an area dominated by saddlers, a guild distinct from harness makers though producing similar goods, and they did not welcome the competition. Johann Georg found himself the target of professional hostility, the kind of petty warfare between rival crafts that characterized the guild system. Business began to decline. The income that had once allowed the family to live fairly well, if not lavishly, began to dwindle. The workshop that had been profitable in its old location struggled in its new one. The smell of leather was the same, the sound of tools on workbenches unchanged, but the customers were fewer and the profits smaller. Through all of this economic uncertainty, Anna Regina managed the household with quiet strength. She stretched every coin, made do with less, and ensured that her children never went hungry even when times were lean. But the strain was beginning to tell on her. Bearing and raising 9 children in an era of limited medical knowledge and harsh living conditions was a trial for any woman, and Anna Regina's health, never robust, began to fail. In 1731, when Immanuel was 7 years old, a man named Franz Albert Schultz arrived in Königsberg as a field chaplain and quickly rose to become the local leader of the Pietist movement. He was appointed director of the Collegium Fridericianum, the Pietist high school, and later became a professor of theology. Anna Regina was among his early converts, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that she found in Schultz's preaching a more intense expression of the faith she already held. Schultz noticed the bright young Immanuel at the Bible study sessions that Anna Regina brought her children to attend. He saw something in the boy, a keen intelligence, a capacity for deep thought, a seriousness of purpose that was unusual in one so young. When Immanuel was 8 years old, Schultz arranged for him to continue his education at the Collegium Fridericianum. This was an extraordinary opportunity for the son of a harness maker, a chance to escape the predetermined path that would have seen Immanuel apprenticed to his father's trade, eventually inheriting the workshop and spending his life working leather as his father and grandfather had done. Instead, Schultz opened the door to a different future, one that might lead to a career in the church or in civil administration, professions that would elevate Immanuel's social status and economic prospects. One can imagine the mixture of pride and apprehension that Anna Regina must have felt as she watched her son enter the Collegium Fridericianum at Easter in 1732. Pride, certainly, that her boy had been singled out for this honor, that his obvious gifts were being recognized and would be cultivated. But also apprehension because she knew what awaited him there. The Collegium Fridericianum was not a gentle place. It was an institution designed to break the will and remake it in the image of Pietist piety. The education was harsh, punitive, highly disciplinary. The focus was overwhelmingly on Latin and religious instruction, with mathematics given short shrift and natural philosophy, what we would call science, barely taught at all. The young Immanuel Kant found himself thrust into a world very different from the one he had known at home. His mother's pietism had been of a gentler variety, blending spiritual devotion with intellectual curiosity and maternal affection. The pietism of the Collegium Fridericianum was far more stringent, far more demanding. Students were subjected to constant soul-searching, required to examine themselves for the smallest sins, encouraged to confess their failings publicly and accept harsh corrections. The teachers were not cruel precisely, but they believed that discipline, physical, mental, and spiritual, was essential to the formation of godly character. They believed that the natural inclinations of children were corrupt and needed to be suppressed, that the only path to salvation lay in absolute obedience to divine law as they interpreted it. For 8.5 years, from age 8 to nearly 17, Kant endured the Collegium Fridericianum. He would later describe his time there in terms that left no doubt about his feelings. He hated it. The forced piety, the endless prayers, the constant examinations of conscience, the rote memorization of religious texts, the harsh discipline, all of it grated against his nature. And yet, paradoxically, he found refuge in the very curriculum that was supposed to subjugate him. He developed a love for Latin classics, particularly for Lucretius, the Roman poet and philosopher who had written about the nature of the universe in terms of atoms and void, who had sought to free humanity from the fear of death and the tyranny of superstition through the power of reason and the contemplation of nature. Imagine young Kant, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, hunched over a text of Lucretius in the dim light of a study hall, finding in those ancient verses a kind of liberation. Lucretius wrote of a universe governed not by the capricious whims of gods but by natural laws, where phenomena could be understood through observation and reason. This was a radical idea, one that contradicted everything the Pietist teachers were trying to instill, and yet here it was, embedded in the very Latin curriculum they had assigned. Kant devoured these texts, finding in them both intellectual stimulation and a form of quiet rebellion. But even as he took refuge in Latin literature, tragedy was approaching. On the 18th of December 1737, when Immanuel was 13 years old, his mother Anna Regina died. She was only 40 years old, worn down by the strain of 9 pregnancies, by the constant work of managing a household in increasingly difficult economic circumstances, by the stresses of life in the 18th century when medical care was primitive and infections could kill with frightening speed. Her 9th pregnancy had taken a terrible toll on her body, and she simply had no strength left to recover. For the young Immanuel, still at the Collegium Fridericinum, still enduring the harsh discipline and forced piety of that institution, the loss of his mother was devastating. She had been his first teacher, the person who had opened his eyes to the wonders of nature, who had nurtured his curiosity, who had shown him that religion could be a source of comfort and moral guidance rather than mere rule-following and fear. The biographers tell us that 13-year-old Immanuel must have keenly felt the loss of his first tutor regarding nature and religious sentiment. This is the kind of understated language that historians use, but behind it we can sense the real grief of a boy who had lost not just a parent but a guide, a confidant, the person who had believed in him and encouraged him when no one else did. Johann George was now alone, a widower with young children to raise and a business that was struggling. The workshop continued, the leather was still worked, the harnesses were still made, but the heart had gone out of things. Immanuel continued at the Collegium Fridericinum, graduating at the end of the summer of 1740. By then he was 16 years old, no longer the wide-eyed child who had walked along the philosophy dam with his mother, but a young man standing on the threshold of his future. His initial interest in the classics remained, but it was beginning to be supplemented and then superseded by a growing fascination with philosophy. On the 24th of September 1740, Immanuel Kant enrolled at the University of Königsberg. He may have initially intended to study theology, following the path that Pastor Schultz had envisioned for him, but that plan, if it ever truly existed, was quickly abandoned. Philosophy called to him with an irresistible voice. At the University of Königsberg, philosophy was not a narrow discipline but an expansive one that encompassed mathematics, physics, logic, metaphysics, ethics, and natural law. It was the study of everything, the attempt to understand the fundamental nature of reality, knowledge, and morality. For a young man who had spent his childhood looking at the stars and wondering about the workings of the universe, who had endured years of forced religious instruction and emerged with more questions than answers, philosophy offered the promise of a systematic, rational approach to the deepest questions of human existence. Kant studied under Martin Knutzen, an associate professor of logic and metaphysics who would prove to be one of the most important influences on his intellectual development. Knutzen was a rationalist in the tradition of Leibniz and Wolff, believing that the power of human reason was sufficient to arrive at certain knowledge about the nature of reality. But Knutzen was also familiar with developments in British philosophy and science, and he introduced Kant to the revolutionary physics of Isaac Newton. Here was a man who had used mathematics to describe the motions of the planets, who had shown that the same laws that governed falling apples also governed the orbits of celestial bodies, who had demonstrated that the universe operated according to precise, knowable principles. Knutzen also introduced Kant to ideas that would prove crucial to his later philosophy. He dissuaded Kant from the theory of pre-established harmony, which Leibniz had proposed to explain how mind and body could interact. This theory, Knutzen argued, was the pillow for the lazy mind, a too easy solution to a difficult problem that discouraged further investigation. Knutzen also steered Kant away from idealism, the notion that reality is purely mental, which most 18th-century philosophers regarded with suspicion if not outright hostility. These early lessons would shape the direction of Kant's thinking, pushing him toward a philosophy that took seriously both the reality of the physical world and the active role of the mind in structuring our knowledge of that world. But Kant's university education was cut short by necessity. In 1746, when Immanuel was 22 years old, his father Johann George died. The exact date was the 24th of March. The harness maker who had written those hopeful words in his diary 22 years earlier, praying that God would grant his son grace until the blessed end of his life, was gone. And with his death, the family's already precarious financial situation became untenable. There was no more income from the workshop. There were still younger siblings who needed support. Immanuel, as the eldest surviving son, had obligations to his family. So he left the university, his formal education incomplete, and became a private tutor. For the next 9 years, from 1746 to 1754, Kant lived and worked in the households of wealthy families in the countryside around Königsberg. He taught Latin, moral philosophy, natural theology, natural law, logic, mathematics, whatever his employers required. He lived in their homes, ate at their tables and educated their children. It was not glamorous work, and it must have been frustrating for a young man of Kant's intellectual caliber to be explaining basic concepts to children of privilege who often had little interest in learning. But it was honest work, and it paid enough to allow Kant to send money home to support his younger siblings. During these 9 years of tutoring in the Prussian countryside, Kant never stopped thinking, never stopped reading when he could find time, never stopped developing his philosophical ideas. The landscape around Königsberg was flat and monotonous in summer, blanketed with snow in winter, but it had a stark beauty that encouraged contemplation. In the evenings, after his teaching duties were done, Kant would perhaps have looked out at those same stars he had observed with his mother so many years ago, and he would have thought about the nature of the universe, about the relationship between observation and theory, about the possibility of knowing truth. In 1754, at the age of 30, Kant finally returned to Königsberg. The city must have seemed both familiar and strange, familiar in its layout and landmarks, strange because he was returning as a different person than the university student who had left 8 years earlier. He was returning with a purpose, to pursue an academic career, to finally engage seriously with the philosophical questions that had been burning in his mind throughout his years of tutoring. In 1755 he submitted his first dissertation and began teaching at the University of Königsberg as a Privatdozent, essentially a private lecturer who was paid directly by students rather than by the university itself. This was a precarious position, offering little financial security and no guarantee of advancement, but it allowed Kant to immerse himself in the world of ideas. And in those first years back in Königsberg he proved to be remarkably productive. He published several scientific works, including one that would eventually become known as the foundation for the nebular hypothesis of solar system formation. This work, titled Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, appeared in 1755, and in it Kant proposed a bold and original theory about how the solar system had come into being. Imagine Kant in his study, perhaps looking out the window at the night sky, thinking about Newton's laws of motion and gravitation, thinking about the observed patterns in the solar system, all the planets orbiting in the same direction, in roughly the same plane with the sun at the center. How had this orderly arrangement come to be? The traditional answer, accepted by most natural philosophers of the time, was that God had created it this way from the beginning, that the current configuration of the solar system was the result of divine design imposed at the moment of creation. But Kant, drawing on Newton's physics, proposed something different. He suggested that the solar system had begun as a vast rotating cloud of gas and dust, a nebula. This primordial cloud, spinning slowly in the darkness of space, had gradually collapsed under its own gravitational attraction. As it collapsed, it spun faster, conservation of angular momentum requiring that as the cloud contracted, its rotation would speed up. The cloud flattened into a disk, and within this disk, particles began to clump together, colliding and sticking, gradually forming larger and larger aggregates. At the center, where most of the mass concentrated, the temperature and pressure became so great that nuclear fusion ignited, and the sun was born. Farther out in the disk, the planets coalesced from the remaining material, each condensing from local concentrations of matter, each inheriting the rotational direction of the original cloud. This was a revolutionary idea because it explained the current state of the solar system not as the result of arbitrary divine fiat but as the natural consequence of physical laws operating over immense periods of time. It suggested that the universe had a history, that it had evolved from simpler initial conditions into the complex arrangements we observe today. It removed, or at least reduced, the need for supernatural intervention in explaining natural phenomena. God might still be the ultimate creator, the author of the physical laws themselves, but those laws, once established, were sufficient to explain the development of the solar system without further divine tinkering. Unfortunately for Kant, this brilliant work had almost no immediate impact. The printer who had agreed to publish Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens went bankrupt before the book could be properly distributed. Most copies were lost or destroyed, and the few that survived languished in obscurity. It would be decades before Kant's ideas on the formation of the solar system would become widely known, and by then the French astronomer Pierre-Simon Laplace would independently develop a similar theory in his Exposition of the System of the World, published in 1796. The combined hypothesis would eventually be known as the Kant-Laplace nebular hypothesis, acknowledging both thinkers' contributions, though Laplace probably developed his version without knowing of Kant's earlier work. The story of the lost publication of Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens is one of those small tragedies that litter the history of science and philosophy, a brilliant idea that might have changed the course of intellectual history if only it had been read by the right people at the right time. But Kant, stoic as ever, continued his work. He continued teaching his classes, living on the meager income provided by student fees, writing other philosophical essays and scientific papers, building his reputation slowly and patiently within the small world of German academic philosophy. For 15 years, from 1755 to 1770, Kant labored as an unsalaried lecturer at the University of Königsberg. 15 years of giving the same lectures, answering the same basic questions from students, living in rented rooms, barely making ends meet, all while the great philosophical system that would eventually make him famous was slowly taking shape in his mind. He applied for professorships and was turned down. In 1758 he was passed over for the chair in logic and metaphysics that he desperately wanted. In 1764 he declined an offer to teach at the University of Erlangen, and in 1770 he turned down another offer from the University of Jena, both times hoping that a position would eventually open up at Königsberg, the city he could not bring himself to leave. And then, finally, in 1770 when Kant was 46 years old, an age when many people are already looking toward retirement, he was appointed to the position he had sought for so long, full professor of logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. To mark this achievement he delivered an inaugural dissertation titled, Concerning the Form and Principles of the Sensible and Intelligible World, often referred to simply as the inaugural dissertation. This work, written in Latin as was still customary for formal academic treatises, already contained many of the key elements that would later appear in his mature philosophy. Kant was now secure, or at least more secure than he had ever been. He had a regular salary, a respected position, the freedom to pursue his research and develop his ideas. He lectured on a wide variety of subjects: logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, natural theology, anthropology, geography, and even practical topics like fortifications and mineralogy. His lectures were popular, drawing students not just from Königsberg but from across Germany and beyond. Kant had a gift for making complex ideas accessible, for illustrating abstract principles with concrete examples, for maintaining a classroom atmosphere that was serious but not stifling. But despite this outward activity, the lecturing, the university politics, the interaction with students and colleagues, Kant's greatest work was still being done in private, in the quiet hours of the early morning before his classes began, in the evenings after his daily walk. Something had happened to Kant's thinking in the years since his appointment to the professorship, something profound and transformative. He would later describe it as being awakened from his dogmatic slumber by the writings of the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume was a radical skeptic who had argued that many of the things we think we know with certainty, particularly the principle of causality, the idea that every effect has a cause, cannot be rationally justified. We believe in cause and effect, Hume argued, not because we can prove it logically or observe it directly, but simply because we have become habituated to seeing certain events follow other events. We see billiard balls colliding thousands of times, and after each collision the first ball stops and the second ball begins to move. From this constant conjunction, we develop the expectation that this pattern will continue, but we never actually observe the causal connection itself. We only observe the succession of events. For all we truly know, Hume suggested, the apparent regularities of nature could be nothing more than cosmic coincidences that happen to have persisted so far but could cease at any moment. This argument struck at the very foundations of Enlightenment thought, which held that human reason was capable of discovering necessary truths about the world. If Hume was right, then all of science, all of philosophy, all of our claims about the nature of reality rested on nothing more solid than habit and custom. We might believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, but we cannot prove it. We might believe that fire causes heat, but we cannot demonstrate it through pure reason. Everything we think we know about the external world turns out to be mere opinion, more or less well supported by past experience but never certain, never necessary. Kant found this conclusion intolerable, but he also found Hume's arguments compelling. He could not simply dismiss Hume as other philosophers had tried to do. The challenge Hume posed was real, and it demanded a real answer. And so Kant set himself the task of finding that answer, of showing how certain knowledge, particularly knowledge of cause and effect, was possible despite Hume's skeptical arguments. He would later say that this project consumed him for more than a decade, that although he finally set down his conclusions in written form in just 4 or 5 months of intensive work, those conclusions were the fruit of 12 years of careful thought. The result was the Critique of Pure Reason, first published in 1781, when Kant was 57 years old. This massive work, over 800 pages in its original edition, was Kant's attempt to determine what we can know and how we can know it, to establish the limits and conditions of human knowledge. The title itself is significant. Critique does not mean criticism in the modern sense but rather careful analysis. Pure reason refers to reason operating independently of experience, to the mind's innate capacity to structure and organize knowledge. Kant's central insight, the idea that would come to be known as his Copernican revolution in philosophy, was this. Rather than assuming that our knowledge must conform to objects as they exist independently of us, we should instead assume that objects must conform to our knowledge. Just as Copernicus had revolutionized astronomy by proposing that the Earth moves around the Sun rather than the other way around, so Kant was proposing a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between mind and world. What Kant meant by this can be understood through a simple analogy. Imagine you are wearing a pair of blue-tinted glasses that you can never remove. Everything you see will appear to have a bluish tint to it. Now, is this blueness a property of the objects themselves, or is it a consequence of the glasses you are wearing? The answer, obviously, is that it is a consequence of the glasses. The objects themselves might be various colors, but you will never be able to see those real colors because you are always seeing them through the blue tint of your glasses. Kant argued that space and time are like those blue-tinted glasses. They are not features of things as they are in themselves but rather the forms through which we necessarily experience things. We cannot experience anything except as existing in space and time because space and time are the structures that our minds impose on our experience. This does not mean that space and time are illusions or that they are merely subjective, in the sense of being arbitrary or variable from person to person. They are universal and necessary features of human experience. Everyone experiences the world spatially and temporally, but they are features of our way of experiencing rather than features of reality independent of our experience. Similarly, Kant argued, concepts like causality are not derived from experience but are brought to experience by the mind. The mind does not passively receive impressions from the external world like a blank slate being written upon. Instead, it actively structures and organizes those impressions according to certain innate categories: causality, substance, unity, plurality, and others. We experience the world as composed of causes and effects, as containing persisting substances that undergo changes, as consisting of multiple distinct objects that can be counted and compared, because these are the ways our minds organize sensory information. This solved Hume's problem because it showed that causality is not something we derive from experience through induction, which would always leave it uncertain and possibly mistaken. Rather, causality is a necessary condition of having experience at all. We cannot experience a world that is not causal because causality is one of the ways our minds structure experience. To ask whether the principle of causality is true is like asking whether space has 3 dimensions. The answer is determined not by examining the world as it is in itself but by examining the necessary conditions of our experience of any world whatsoever. But this solution came with a price. If space, time, causality, and the other categories of understanding are contributions of the mind rather than features of things in themselves, then we can never know things as they are in themselves, independent of our experience of them. We can only know appearances, the world as it appears to us when structured by our forms of intuition and categories of understanding. This realm of appearance, which Kant called the phenomenal world, is the only world we can ever have knowledge of. The realm of things in themselves, which he called the noumenal world, is forever beyond our cognitive reach. This might seem like a deeply pessimistic conclusion. We can never know reality as it truly is. But Kant saw it differently. By establishing the limits of knowledge, he had also secured its foundations. We can have genuine knowledge of the phenomenal world, knowledge that is universal and necessary, because that world is structured by the necessary conditions of human cognition. The laws of nature, properly understood, are not contingent regularities that might change tomorrow but necessary conditions of any possible experience. Science is secure, mathematics is secure, our everyday knowledge of the physical world is secure. Not because we have succeeded in grasping things as they are in themselves, but because we have understood the a priori conditions that make experience possible. The Critique of Pure Reason is a notoriously difficult book, and when it was first published, relatively few people read it and fewer still understood it. Kant, hoping to make his ideas more accessible, published a shorter work 2 years later titled Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, which presented the main arguments of the critique in a somewhat more digestible form. Gradually, his ideas began to spread through the German philosophical world, generating both enthusiasm and controversy. Some philosophers embraced Kant's critical philosophy as a breakthrough that had finally solved the problems that had plagued philosophy for centuries. Others attacked it vigorously, arguing that Kant had made knowledge impossible by cutting us off from reality, or that his arguments were circular and self-refuting, or that his system was too complex and artificial to be true. But whether they agreed with him or not, all serious philosophers had to engage with Kant's work. He had set the terms of the debate, and philosophy would never be the same. Even as the academic world was absorbing and reacting to the critique of pure reason, Kant was already moving on to the next phase of his philosophical project. The first critique had dealt with theoretical reason, with the question of what we can know and how we can know it. Now Kant turned his attention to practical reason, to questions of morality, freedom, and the will. The result was the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1785, and the Critique of Practical Reason, published in 1788. In these works, Kant developed his moral philosophy, centered on the concept of the categorical imperative. Most of what we think of as moral rules, Kant argued, are actually hypothetical imperatives, conditional commands that depend on what we want to achieve. If you want people to trust you, then you should tell the truth. If you want to stay healthy, then you should exercise regularly. These are perfectly sensible pieces of advice, but they are not moral laws in the strictest sense because they can be evaded by changing our goals. If I do not care whether people trust me, then the first rule no longer applies to me. A true moral law, Kant argued, must be a categorical imperative, an unconditional command that applies to all rational beings regardless of their desires or circumstances. But what could such a law be? How could we derive moral obligations that are universal and binding from pure reason alone, without appealing to particular human goals or cultural traditions? Kant's answer was the famous formulation, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This might sound abstract, but its application is relatively straightforward. Before you act, you should ask yourself, what if everyone acted according to the principle I am about to follow? If the result would be logically impossible or self-defeating, then the action is immoral. Consider lying, for example. Imagine you are thinking of lying to get out of trouble. The maxim of your action might be, when it serves my interests, I will make false promises. Now apply the universalization test. What if everyone acted on this maxim? What if everyone made false promises whenever it suited them? The institution of promising would collapse. No one would believe anyone else's promises because everyone would know that promises are routinely broken when convenient. But if no one believed promises, then your lie could not work. You could not successfully lie to get out of trouble because no one would believe you in the first place. The maxim is self-defeating when universalized, which means, according to Kant, that lying is immoral. This is a powerful and elegant way of thinking about morality because it grounds ethical obligations in reason itself rather than in feelings, consequences, or divine commands. It does not matter whether you feel like lying is wrong, or whether the consequences of a particular lie might be beneficial, or whether God has commanded you not to lie. What matters is whether you could consistently will that the principle of your action become a universal law. If you cannot, then the action is contrary to duty and should not be done. But Kant did not stop with this first formulation of the categorical imperative. He believed that there were several ways of expressing the same fundamental moral law, each highlighting a different aspect of what morality demands. The second major formulation was, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. This formulation emphasizes the intrinsic dignity and worth of rational beings. People are not tools to be used for our purposes. They have their own goals, their own plans, their own rational agency, and these must be respected. To use someone merely as a means is to treat them as if they were a thing rather than a person, as if their value consisted entirely in their usefulness to us rather than in their own capacity for rational self-determination. This does not mean we can never use people to achieve our goals. We do this constantly in ordinary life when we hire workers, ask for directions, buy goods from merchants. But in all these cases, we are also recognizing the other person's autonomy, respecting their right to consent to the transaction, acknowledging that they are pursuing their own ends even as they help us pursue ours. The immorality lies in treating someone only as a means, in using them without regard for their own rational nature. Kant's moral philosophy, like his theoretical philosophy, was revolutionary. It placed the source of moral obligation not in external authority but in reason itself, not in consequences but in principles, not in particular cultural traditions but in universal rational law. It implied that morality was the same for all rational beings everywhere, that the moral law that applied in Königsberg in the 18th century would apply equally on the other side of the world, or in the distant future, or even to rational aliens on other planets if such beings existed. This universalism, this insistence on the equal dignity of all rational agents, would prove to be enormously influential in the development of modern concepts of human rights and democratic government. During all this intensive philosophical work, Kant maintained a daily routine of extraordinary regularity. His biographers tell us, and the citizens of Königsberg confirmed from their own observations, that Kant's life was arranged with such precision that people could set their watches by his daily walk. Every day without fail, unless he was ill or the weather was extraordinarily bad, Kant would take the same walk at the same time along the same route that became known as the philosopher's walk. He would emerge from his house wearing the same style of clothing, carrying the same walking stick, moving with the same measured pace, and the townspeople, seeing him pass, would check their pocket watches and adjust them if necessary. This punctuality, this regularity, might seem obsessive or even ridiculous from our more casual modern perspective. But for Kant, it was a deliberate choice, a way of organizing his life to maximize his productivity and maintain his health. Kant was a small man, barely 5 feet tall, with a deformed chest and a constitution that was never robust. He believed that his longevity, he would live to be nearly 80 in an era when life expectancy was far shorter, was the result of his careful attention to diet, exercise, and routine. He treated the maintenance of his health as a moral duty, as something he owed to himself and to the rational nature that inhabited his fragile body. The daily schedule went like this. Kant's servant would wake him at exactly 4:55 in the morning. By 5 o'clock, he would be at his desk, having consumed 2 cups of tea and smoked a single pipe of tobacco. Still wearing his dressing gown, he would prepare for his lectures, which began at 7 o'clock sharp. After delivering his lecture for 2 hours, finishing precisely at 9 in the morning, Kant would return home, change back into his dressing gown, and work on his writings until 12:45 in the afternoon. Then he would dress for his midday meal, which was the main social event of his day. Kant did not eat alone. He would invite friends, colleagues, visiting scholars, or students to join him for dinner, and these meals were famous in Königsberg for the quality of the conversation. Kant was a lively and engaging host, interested in everything from the latest scientific discoveries to political events to gossip about mutual acquaintances. He had a particular fascination with accounts of travel and exploration, devouring books about distant lands he would never visit, questioning his guests minutely about any journeys they had taken. His memory for geographical details was prodigious, and he could discourse knowledgeably about places he had never seen, basing his understanding entirely on reading and conversation. These dinner conversations went on for several hours, often extending past 4 in the afternoon. Then Kant would take his famous walk, the one that the citizens of Königsberg used to set their clocks. He would walk alone, lost in thought, working through philosophical problems in his mind as he traced his familiar route through the streets and lanes of the city. The story is told that one day he became so absorbed in thinking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau's novel Émile, which he had just read, that he broke his routine for several days, wandering aimlessly and returning home at unpredictable times, much to the consternation of the Königsbergers who relied on his punctuality. After his walk, Kant would return home for light refreshment and then spend the evening reading, particularly travel narratives and works of natural history. He would go to bed at exactly 10 o'clock in the evening, allowing himself precisely 7 hours before his servant woke him again at 4:55. This schedule, repeated day after day, year after year, became the framework within which one of the most powerful intellects in human history operated. The very regularity that strikes us as almost mechanical was, for Kant, the necessary condition of his philosophical productivity. By eliminating uncertainty and variation from the mundane aspects of life, he freed his mind to grapple with the profound uncertainties of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. It would be a mistake, however, to think of Kant as a mere thinking machine, a brain sustained by clockwork habits. He was deeply engaged with the world around him, concerned about political events, passionate about education and social reform, committed to the ideals of the Enlightenment even as he subjected those ideals to rigorous critical examination. In 1784 he published a short essay in response to a question that had been posed by a Berlin journal: "What is enlightenment?" This essay, though brief, contains some of Kant's most famous and influential pronouncements on the nature of rational autonomy and political freedom. Enlightenment, Kant wrote, is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. The problem, Kant argued, was not that people lacked the intelligence to think for themselves, but that they lacked the courage. Sapere aude, he proclaimed, dare to know. Have courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of enlightenment. But what keeps people in this state of self-imposed immaturity? Kant identified two main culprits: laziness and cowardice. It is so much easier to let others think for us, to accept the pronouncements of authorities rather than investigating matters ourselves, to follow established customs rather than questioning whether they make sense. It is so easy to be immature, Kant wrote. If I have a book that understands for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet and so forth, I need not trouble myself. This might seem like a call for anarchy or revolution, for the wholesale rejection of authority and tradition. But Kant was more subtle than that. He distinguished between what he called the public use of reason and the private use of reason. The public use of reason occurs when we, as scholars or citizens, offer our opinions to the world at large through writing or public speech. This use of reason, Kant argued, must be free if enlightenment is to progress. Scholars must be able to publish their critiques of existing institutions, to propose reforms, to argue for new ways of thinking, without fear of censorship or persecution. The private use of reason, by contrast, occurs when we are acting in our official capacity, when we have taken on a particular role within society that comes with specific duties and obligations. In these contexts, obedience may be necessary even when we privately disagree with what we are required to do. A soldier must follow orders even if he thinks the orders are unwise. A civil servant must implement laws even if she believes the laws are unjust. A clergyman must preach the doctrines of his church even if his personal study has led him to different conclusions. But, and this is crucial, even while obeying in their official capacity, these individuals retain the right to use their reason publicly, to argue as scholars or citizens for changes in the very orders, laws, or doctrines they are currently obliged to follow. The soldier can obey his commander in battle while writing pamphlets arguing for military reform. The civil servant can enforce unjust laws while publishing articles advocating for their repeal. The clergyman can deliver the orthodox sermon while publishing theological treatises that question orthodoxy. This careful balance between obedience and freedom was typical of Kant's political philosophy. He was not a revolutionary. He lived through the French Revolution, watching from afar as France descended into terror and chaos, and while he sympathized with many of the revolutionaries' goals, he was deeply troubled by their methods. He believed that political change must come through gradual reform, through the slow process of public enlightenment rather than through violent upheaval. The path to a better society lay not in overthrowing kings but in educating citizens, not in destroying existing institutions but in subjecting them to rational criticism that would lead to their peaceful transformation. And yet, for all his caution and conservatism in political matters, Kant's ideas contain the seeds of radical social transformation. His insistence on the equal dignity of all rational beings, his argument that people should be treated as ends in themselves rather than mere means, his vision of a kingdom of ends in which all rational agents would be both subject to the moral law and authors of it, these ideas would inspire generations of reformers, revolutionaries, and advocates for human rights. The Kantian principle that every person possesses intrinsic worth regardless of their social status, wealth, or power would become one of the foundational ideas of modern democratic theory. Nowhere was this more evident than in Kant's writings on international relations, particularly his essay Perpetual Peace, published in 1795. This short work, structured like a peace treaty with preliminary articles and definitive articles, laid out Kant's vision for how wars between nations might finally be ended and lasting peace established. The preliminary articles proposed immediate steps that could be taken to reduce the likelihood of war. No peace treaty should be concluded with secret reservations for future war, no state should be acquired by inheritance or purchase, standing armies should be gradually abolished, no national debts should be contracted for the purpose of foreign adventures, no state should interfere in the internal affairs of another, and acts of hostility should not be conducted in ways that would make future trust impossible. But it was the definitive articles that contained Kant's most profound proposals. First, he argued that all states should adopt republican constitutions in which power is divided, laws are made by representatives of the people, and rulers are accountable to the governed. Kant believed that republics were inherently less warlike than monarchies or tyrannies because the people who would actually have to fight and die in wars would have a say in whether those wars were declared. A king could send his subjects to war for reasons of glory or territorial aggrandizement without having to bear the costs himself, but in a republic, the citizens who would bear those costs could refuse to authorize unnecessary wars. Second, Kant proposed that the law of nations should be founded on a federation of free states. Nations should enter into a league, similar to the way individuals enter into a civil society, agreeing to submit their disputes to arbitration and to renounce the use of force as a means of settling disagreements. This was not a proposal for world government, which Kant thought would be impractical and likely to become tyrannical. Rather, it was a vision of independent states voluntarily cooperating, maintaining their sovereignty while agreeing to certain rules and procedures that would prevent the outbreak of war. Third, Kant argued for what he called cosmopolitan right, the idea that all human beings, by virtue of their common humanity, have certain rights that transcend national boundaries. In particular, he argued for a right of universal hospitality, meaning that people should be free to travel to foreign lands and should not be treated with hostility simply for being strangers, provided they come peacefully. This did not mean a right to settle wherever one wished, but rather a right to visit, to engage in commerce, to communicate and exchange ideas across cultural boundaries. These proposals might seem modest or even obvious from our vantage point in the 21st century, but in the context of late 18th century Europe, where dynastic wars were routine and the very idea of international law was barely developed, they were remarkably progressive. Kant was arguing for a fundamental reconceptualization of international relations, from a state of nature characterized by perpetual conflict and the threat of force to a lawful condition in which disputes would be settled by reason and arbitration rather than by violence. The influence of perpetual peace has been profound and lasting. When the League of Nations was founded after the First World War, and later when the United Nations was established after the Second World War, the architects of these institutions drew explicitly on Kantian ideas. The notion that there should be international bodies to mediate disputes, that nations should agree to submit their conflicts to arbitration, that there are universal human rights that transcend particular political communities, all of these concepts can be traced back, in part, to Kant's vision in perpetual peace. The ideal has not been fully realized, of course. Wars continue, nations still resort to force, and the international order remains fragile. But the very existence of institutions like the United Nations, the very notion that war is an evil to be prevented rather than a normal state of affairs, owes something to the philosopher who never left Königsberg. During the 1780s and 1790s, as Kant's fame spread throughout the German-speaking world and beyond, his daily life in Königsberg continued with its characteristic regularity. He lectured, he wrote, he walked, he entertained at dinner, he read late into the evening. Students flocked to hear his lectures, some traveling from great distances to study under the master. His books were widely read and hotly debated. He became, quite simply, the most famous philosopher in Europe, the sage of Königsberg whose pronouncements were awaited with anticipation and whose system was either embraced as the solution to all philosophical problems or attacked as the source of new confusions. But as the century drew to a close, shadows began to lengthen across Kant's life. In 1797, Frederick William II, who had succeeded Frederick the Great as King of Prussia, died and was replaced by Frederick William III. This transition might seem like merely a political fact of little relevance to a philosopher concerned with timeless truths, but it had real consequences for Kant. Under Frederick the Great, who had been a patron of philosophy and had guaranteed freedom of thought and expression, Kant had been able to write and publish without interference. But Frederick William II was more conservative, more concerned with religious orthodoxy, more suspicious of philosophical speculation that might undermine traditional beliefs. In 1793, Kant had published a book titled Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, in which he attempted to show that the essential truths of religion, the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, the importance of moral striving, could be established on rational grounds without appeal to revelation or scripture. This was typical of Kant's Enlightenment approach. He wanted to preserve what he saw as the core of religious faith while freeing it from dogmatic accretions and making it compatible with reason and science. But to the Prussian censors, the book looked dangerously rationalistic, as if Kant were reducing religion to mere philosophy, stripping away the supernatural and the mysterious in favor of bloodless abstraction. Kant was summoned before the censorship board and reprimanded for misusing his philosophy to distort and depreciate fundamental doctrines of Scripture and Christianity. He was ordered not to lecture or write anything further on religious subjects. Kant, ever the dutiful subject even as he advocated for intellectual freedom, agreed to comply, though he interpreted his promise carefully. He had pledged to refrain from religious writings as His Majesty's loyal subject, which meant, Kant reasoned, that the promise bound him only during the lifetime of Frederick William II. When the king died in 1797, Kant considered himself released from his vow, though by that time he was already declining into the frailty of old age and did little further writing on any subject. The final years of Kant's life were marked by a gradual dimming of his formidable mental powers. It is a sad irony that the philosopher who had done more than anyone to explore the nature and limits of human reason should himself be betrayed by his own failing faculties. By the early 1800s, Kant's memory was deteriorating, his ability to concentrate was diminishing, his once crystalline thoughts were becoming confused and disjointed. He gave his last lecture in the summer of 1796, at the age of 72, and officially retired from the university. He continued to receive visitors and to correspond with friends and former students, but these interactions became increasingly difficult as his mental decline accelerated. His friends watched with sorrow as the great mind that had revolutionized philosophy slowly faded. There are accounts of Kant in his final years that are almost unbearably poignant, trying to recall familiar faces but unable to place them, struggling to complete sentences, losing his train of thought mid-conversation, aware on some level that something was terribly wrong but unable to articulate what it was or to stop the erosion of his selfhood. The daily walks continued for a time, but they became shorter and less frequent. The clockwork regularity that had structured his life for decades began to break down, not through choice but through the simple failure of his aging body and mind. On the 12th of February 1804, just a few months before what would have been his 80th birthday, Immanuel Kant died in his house in Königsberg. His last words, according to those present, were "Es ist gut," it is good. Whether he meant that his life had been good, or that death was a welcome relief from the confusion and disability of his final years, or something else entirely, we cannot know. But those simple words, spoken by a man who had spent his life analyzing the nature of goodness and duty and right action, carry a particular weight and poignancy. The funeral was an enormous affair, attended by thousands of people from all walks of life. Professors and students, craftsmen and merchants, government officials and common laborers, all came to pay their respects to the man who had spent his entire life in this one city, who had walked its streets and thought its thoughts and whose daily routine had become part of its collective life. He was buried in the Königsberg Cathedral, and on his tomb were inscribed the words he himself had written in the conclusion to the Critique of Practical Reason. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the oftener and the more steadily we reflect on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. These words capture something essential about Kant's philosophy and about the man himself. The starry heavens, those vast spaces that had fascinated him since childhood, when his mother had pointed out the constellations on their evening walks, that had inspired his scientific work on the formation of the solar system, that reminded him always of the sublime scope and grandeur of nature. And the moral law, that internal sense of duty and obligation that his mother had first awakened in him, that he had subjected to rigorous philosophical analysis, that he had argued was as universal and necessary as the laws of physics, that made human beings something more than mere natural objects subject to mechanical causation. The starry heavens and the moral law. The external world of nature, governed by deterministic laws of cause and effect, knowable through science and mathematics. And the internal world of freedom, where rational beings make choices, where ought matters as much as is, where we are not mere spectators but agents, not mere objects but subjects. Kant spent his entire philosophical career trying to understand how these two realms could coexist, how we could be both natural beings subject to causal laws and free beings capable of moral choice, how the same creatures who were part of nature could also transcend it through reason and will. His answer, in brief, was that we inhabit both realms simultaneously. As phenomenal beings, as objects of empirical investigation, we are indeed part of nature, subject to its laws, our actions determined by prior causes stretching back into the infinite past. But as noumenal beings, as rational agents, we possess a kind of freedom that is not subject to natural causation, that allows us to initiate new chains of causes based on our rational decisions rather than merely continuing chains determined by prior events. This dual citizenship, in both the natural world and the intelligible world, is what makes morality possible and what makes us, in Kant's view, capable of that peculiar dignity that distinguishes persons from things. Now let us turn to examine more deeply the implications and applications of Kant's thought, the ways his ideas rippled outward to influence not only professional philosophers but also poets, novelists, political theorists, scientists, and ordinary people trying to make sense of their place in the cosmos. The revolutionary nature of his philosophical system cannot be overstated. Where previous philosophers had assumed that knowledge meant conforming our minds to an independently existing reality, Kant proposed that reality as we know it conforms to the structures of our minds. This was not solipsism or idealism in the traditional sense. Kant was not saying that reality is all in our heads or that we create the world through our thoughts. Rather, he was arguing that the world of our experience, the only world we can ever have knowledge of, is necessarily structured by certain features of human cognition. Consider what happens when you look at a tree. The naive view is that the tree exists independently of you with certain properties: height, color, shape, the rustling of its leaves in the wind, and when you look at it, your mind forms a representation that either accurately or inaccurately reflects those properties as they exist in themselves. Knowledge, on this view, is a matter of achieving correspondence between mental representations and the way things really are. The closer the match, the more you know. The poorer the match, the more you are mistaken or ignorant. But Kant argued that this picture is fundamentally flawed. You can never step outside your own experience to compare your mental representations with things as they are in themselves, independent of any representation. All you ever have access to is experience, the world as it appears to you, structured by the forms of your sensibility and the categories of your understanding. Space and time are not properties of things in themselves but rather the forms through which you necessarily experience things. Causality is not a feature of reality independent of mind but rather one of the ways the mind organizes its experience. This does not mean that reality is just in your head, or that you can make things be however you want them to be simply by thinking differently. The appearances are not arbitrary or subjective in that sense. They are constrained by the sensory input you receive from things in themselves, the noumenal reality that affects your sensibility but can never be known directly. Moreover, the forms and categories through which you structure experience are universal and necessary. They are the same for all rational beings and are required conditions for any experience whatsoever. So while you cannot know things as they are in themselves, you can have genuine, objective knowledge of the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. This reconceptualization of knowledge had far-reaching consequences. For one thing, it answered Hume's skepticism about causality. Hume had argued that we can never observe causal connections, only the constant conjunction of events, and therefore we cannot be certain that effects are really produced by their causes. But if causality is one of the ways the mind structures experience, then it is guaranteed to hold in the phenomenal world, which is the only world we can ever have knowledge of. Causality is not derived from experience but is a necessary condition of having experience in the first place. Similarly, Kant's theory provided a new foundation for mathematics and physics. If space and time are forms of our sensibility rather than properties of things in themselves, then mathematical truths about space and time, the theorems of geometry, the laws of arithmetic, are not contingent empirical generalizations that might turn out to be false. They are necessary truths that reflect the structure of our own minds, truths that any possible experience must conform to. And if the basic principles of Newtonian physics, conservation of matter, the persistence of substance, the law of causality, are applications of the categories of understanding, then they too have a kind of necessity and universality that goes beyond mere empirical generalization. But the most radical consequence of Kant's critical philosophy was the distinction it drew between the phenomenal and noumenal realms, between the world as it appears and things as they are in themselves. This distinction created space for Kant to argue that while we are determined as phenomenal beings, our actions explicable in terms of prior causes, our choices predictable given sufficient knowledge of our character and circumstances, we are nevertheless free as noumenal beings, capable of initiating action based on reason rather than merely being pushed along by the causal chain. This might seem like philosophical sleight of hand, an attempt to have freedom and determinism at the same time by simply dividing reality into two realms and assigning each to a different realm. And many of Kant's critics have indeed accused him of this. But Kant's argument is more sophisticated than it might initially appear. He is not simply asserting that we are both free and determined. Rather, he is trying to show that the very same actions can be understood in two different ways, as phenomenal events subject to natural causation and as noumenal acts of rational agency. Consider a simple example. You decide to raise your arm. From a physiological perspective, this action can be fully explained in terms of neural signals, muscle contractions, electrochemical processes, all of which are governed by deterministic laws. There is, in principle, no mystery here. Given complete knowledge of the prior state of your brain and body, a sufficiently powerful computer could predict that you would raise your arm at exactly that moment. But from the perspective of rational agency, you raised your arm because you decided to, because you had reasons for doing so, because it made sense in the context of your purposes and plans. This is a different kind of explanation, not reducible to the causal mechanical account even though it describes the same event. Kant argued that both explanations are valid and neither excludes the other. As phenomenal beings, we are indeed determined by causes. But as noumenal beings, as rational agents, we are capable of acting on the basis of reasons, of determining ourselves according to principles we have adopted through rational reflection. This is what freedom consists in, not the ability to act without any determination whatsoever, which would be mere randomness, but the ability to be self-determining, to act according to laws we give ourselves through reason rather than simply being pushed around by external forces or internal impulses. This concept of autonomy, literally self-law-giving, is central to Kant's moral philosophy. When we act morally according to the categorical imperative, we are not obeying an external authority or responding to incentives and disincentives. We are following a law that our own reason prescribes, recognizing in that law the expression of our rational nature. This is why moral action has dignity, why it commands respect. It is the manifestation of our capacity for rational self-determination, our ability to transcend the merely natural order and act on principle. By establishing a strict routine and adhering to it regardless of inclination, Kant was practicing what he preached. He was demonstrating that action need not be determined by desire, that one could live according to principles adopted through reason rather than simply following the path of least resistance or pursuing whatever seemed pleasant in the moment. Every morning when his servant woke him at 4:55, presumably before he would have naturally woken, and he got up despite wanting to stay in bed, he was exercising his freedom, his capacity for self-determination. Every day when he took his walk at the same time regardless of whether he felt like it, he was acting from duty rather than inclination. This might seem like a grim, joyless way to live, and there is no doubt that Kant's existence lacked many of the pleasures and comforts that most people seek. He never married, never had children, never experienced romantic love. He never traveled beyond the immediate environs of Königsberg, never saw the ocean despite living near the Baltic coast, never visited the great cities of Europe or the natural wonders that lay beyond his hometown. His pleasures were largely intellectual, the satisfaction of solving a philosophical problem, the enjoyment of good conversation over dinner, the quiet contentment of an evening spent reading by candlelight. But to see Kant's life as impoverished or restricted would be to miss something essential. For Kant, the highest good, the thing that gave life its deepest meaning, was not pleasure or comfort or even happiness in the conventional sense. It was the cultivation and exercise of rational autonomy, the development of one's capacity to think for oneself and act on principle. And by this measure, Kant's life was extraordinarily rich. He spent 8 decades thinking deeply about the most fundamental questions of human existence. He made contributions to philosophy that will likely be discussed and debated as long as people care about knowledge, morality, and freedom. He influenced the course of intellectual history, shaping how generations of thinkers would approach problems of epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics. Moreover, the very simplicity and regularity of his external life freed him to lead an intensely rich internal life. By minimizing the time and energy devoted to practical matters, by eliminating uncertainty and variation from his daily routine, he maximized the time and energy available for thought. The clockwork of his habits was the scaffold that supported the cathedral of his mind. And what a cathedral it was! Vast, intricate, carefully constructed, each part precisely fitted to every other part, the whole designed to honor truth and reason as medieval cathedrals were designed to honor God. Prior to Kant, most ethical theories fell into one of two broad categories. There were consequentialist theories, which held that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on its consequences. The most famous of these was utilitarianism, which would be systematically developed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the generation after Kant, though similar ideas had been around for much longer. According to consequentialism, you determine what you ought to do by calculating which action will produce the best outcome, the greatest happiness for the greatest number or the maximum overall good, or however you choose to measure value. And there were virtue ethics theories, descended from Aristotle, which focused not on particular actions or their consequences but on the character of the moral agent. To be ethical, on this view, is to cultivate certain virtues, courage, temperance, justice, wisdom, and to act in ways that express and reinforce those virtues. The good person is the person who has developed the right kind of character, who instinctively responds to situations in ways that are appropriate and praiseworthy. Kant rejected both approaches, though for different reasons. Consequentialism, he argued, made morality too contingent, too dependent on matters beyond our control. Whether our actions have good consequences often depends on circumstances we cannot predict or factors we cannot influence. If I try to help someone and accidentally make things worse, have I acted immorally? If I try to harm someone and accidentally benefit them instead, have I acted morally? Consequentialism seems to give the wrong answer to these questions because it focuses on results rather than intentions. More fundamentally, consequentialism bases moral obligation on the pursuit of some end, happiness, pleasure, well-being, or whatever. But this means that moral commands are really hypothetical imperatives. If you want to maximize happiness, then you should do X. What if I do not care about maximizing happiness? What if I am selfish or cruel or indifferent? Then, on a consequentialist view, morality simply does not apply to me. Kant thought this could not be right. Morality must bind all rational beings regardless of their desires or goals. It must consist of categorical imperatives that apply unconditionally. Virtue ethics, meanwhile, struck Kant as too vague and too dependent on particular cultural contexts. Different cultures have different lists of virtues, different conceptions of what counts as courageous or temperate or just. How are we to adjudicate between these? By what standard can we determine which character traits really are virtuous? Moreover, focusing on character rather than action seems to miss something important. What matters morally is not just what kind of person you are, but what you actually do, what choices you make, how you treat other people. So Kant sought a third way, grounding morality in reason itself, in the form of rational willing rather than in the content of particular desires or cultural norms. The categorical imperative provides a procedure for testing any proposed maxim. Can you will that everyone act on this principle? If so, the action is permissible. If not, it is forbidden. This test is supposed to be universally accessible to any rational being, not dependent on particular experiences or cultural background, not requiring special revelation or authority. This idea, that every person, simply by virtue of being a rational agent capable of self-determination, has infinite worth and deserves respect, has become one of the foundational principles of modern moral and political thought. It underlies the concept of human rights, the notion that there are certain things that cannot be done to people regardless of the consequences, certain basic freedoms and protections that every person is entitled to simply by virtue of being human. When we say that torture is wrong even if it might save lives, that slavery is wrong even if it is economically beneficial, that genocide is wrong even when perpetrated against a powerless minority, we are appealing, implicitly or explicitly, to a Kantian idea about the inviolability of persons. The influence of this idea can be traced through many of the most important moral and political developments of the past 2 centuries. The abolitionist movement that fought to end slavery, the suffragist movement that fought for women's right to vote, the civil rights movement that fought against racial segregation and discrimination, the movement for LGBTQ rights, the movement against human trafficking. All of these have drawn on the fundamental intuition that people have inherent dignity and cannot be treated as mere means to someone else's ends. Similarly, the development of international human rights law, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 to the various treaties and conventions that have followed, has been shaped by Kantian ideas about the equal worth of all persons regardless of nationality, race, religion, or any other contingent characteristic. When the preamble to the Universal Declaration states that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, it is expressing a fundamentally Kantian vision. It is no exaggeration to say that the entire course of Western philosophy in the 19th and 20th centuries was shaped by engagement with Kant's ideas, whether in the form of elaboration, critique, or attempted transcendence. Almost immediately after the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason, philosophers began developing their own systems in response to Kant's. The first major movement to emerge was German idealism, championed by figures like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, and most famously George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. These thinkers accepted Kant's starting point, that the mind plays an active role in constituting knowledge, that we cannot know things as they are in themselves, but they rejected his conclusion that the noumenal realm must remain forever inaccessible. Hegel, the most systematic and influential of the German idealists, constructed an elaborate philosophical system in which all of reality is the progressive self-manifestation of the absolute through a dialectical process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Everything that exists, from the simplest logical categories to the most complex social institutions, represents a stage in this cosmic unfolding. History is not random or chaotic but is the rational development of spirit toward greater self-consciousness and freedom. Kant's philosophy, for Hegel, represented an important stage in this development, but one that needed to be transcended. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, another major philosophical movement emerged in reaction to German idealism, Neo-Kantianism. Philosophers like Hermann Cohen, Paul Natorp, and Ernst Cassirer sought to return to Kant, but a Kant purified of metaphysical extravagance, focused on the epistemological project of determining the conditions of scientific knowledge. They stripped away Kant's talk of things in themselves and noumenal freedom, concentrating instead on the analysis of how the mind constructs the world of experience through its forms and categories. Meanwhile, in a very different philosophical tradition, Kant's ideas were having a profound impact on the development of analytic philosophy. Gottlob Frege, working in the late 19th century, developed modern logic and the foundations of analytic philosophy partly in response to Kant's claims about the nature of mathematical knowledge. Frege wanted to show that mathematics was purely logical, that it did not require the intuitions of space and time that Kant had argued were essential. This led to the development of formal logic and eventually to the logical positivism of the Vienna Circle, which sought to reject all metaphysics as meaningless nonsense. In the existentialist tradition, Kant's emphasis on freedom and autonomy found new expression in the works of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Sartre's famous slogan, "Existence precedes essence," can be seen as a radicalization of Kant's idea of autonomy. For Kant, rational beings give themselves the moral law, determining through reason what they ought to do. For Sartre, human beings not only give themselves moral law but create their own essence, defining through their free choices what it means to be human. There is no fixed human nature, no pre-existing essence that determines who we should be. We are radically free, condemned to make ourselves through our actions. But Kant's influence extended beyond professional philosophy into broader culture and politics. His emphasis on enlightenment, on daring to use one's own understanding, became a rallying cry for educational reform and intellectual freedom. His vision of perpetual peace through international institutions and republican government influenced the development of international law and the creation of organizations like the League of Nations and later the United Nations. His concept of human dignity shaped modern human rights discourse and provided philosophical grounding for opposition to slavery, totalitarianism, and genocide. In science, Kant's ideas about the active role of the mind in structuring experience influenced how scientists thought about their relationship to nature. The realization that observation is never pure, that all scientific knowledge is mediated by theoretical frameworks and conceptual schemes, can be traced back to Kant's insight that we cannot know things as they are in themselves but only as they appear to us through our forms of intuition and categories of understanding. This does not mean that science is merely subjective or arbitrary, but it does mean that scientific knowledge is always knowledge from a particular perspective, structured by particular theoretical commitments. In the arts, Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, had enormous influence on aesthetics and art theory. In this work, Kant analyzed the nature of aesthetic judgment, how we make claims about beauty and sublimity, how aesthetic experience differs from ordinary perception and from conceptual knowledge. He argued that judgments of beauty are based on a kind of harmony between imagination and understanding, a free play of faculties that produces pleasure without being grounded in any definite concept. The sublime, meanwhile, involves an experience of something vast or powerful that initially overwhelms our faculties but ultimately reveals our own capacity for reason and freedom, which transcends any merely natural object. This extraordinarily wide-ranging influence is remarkable when you consider that Kant spent his entire life in one small city, never traveling, never holding political office, never founding an institution or movement. He simply thought and wrote and taught, producing works of formidable difficulty that required years of study to fully understand. Yet those works reshaped the intellectual landscape of Europe and eventually the world. This is the power of ideas, not ideas in the abstract, but ideas developed with rigor and precision, worked out in meticulous detail, defended with carefully constructed arguments. The image of Kant walking the streets of Königsberg with such regularity that citizens set their clocks by his passing has become iconic, representing the clockwork philosopher, the man who lived by routine and rule. But what does it really mean? Why did this become the defining image of Kant's life? Part of the answer, surely, is that it captures something genuinely remarkable and distinctive about Kant. Most people's lives do not have this kind of regularity. We vary our routines, change our plans, respond to circumstances, allow ourselves to be flexible. The idea of following exactly the same schedule day after day for decades strikes us as almost inhuman, as the behavior of a machine rather than a person. But the image also captures something admirable, something that speaks to Kant's dedication and discipline. How many of us, even those who aspire to great achievements, have the self-control to maintain such a regimen? How many could resist the temptation to postpone work when inspiration did not come? Kant's clockwork regularity was not just a quirk of personality but an expression of his deepest philosophical convictions about the importance of rational self-determination, about living according to principles rather than merely following inclination. Moreover, the clockwork image points to a paradox at the heart of Kant's philosophy. On the one hand, Kant argued passionately for freedom, for autonomy, for the capacity of rational beings to determine themselves according to principles they give themselves through reason. On the other hand, his own life seemed to exemplify the opposite: rigid adherence to externally imposed routine, machine-like regularity, the subjugation of feeling to rule. How can these be reconciled? The answer is that true freedom, in Kant's view, is not the absence of constraint but the capacity to constrain oneself according to rational principles. The person who follows their every whim, who does whatever feels good in the moment, is not free in any meaningful sense. They are merely being pushed around by desires, which themselves are the product of natural causes beyond their control. The person who follows a rule because it has been imposed by an external authority is also not fully free. True freedom consists in legislating for yourself, in determining through your own reason what principles you will follow and then following them even when doing so is difficult or unpleasant. From this perspective, Kant's clockwork routine was not the antithesis of freedom but its fullest expression. By establishing a schedule and adhering to it through an act of will, he was exercising his autonomy, his capacity for rational self-determination. The regularity was not imposed on him by external circumstances or natural necessity. It was something he had chosen, something he maintained through continuous effort. Every morning when he woke at the same time, every day when he took his walk at the same hour, he was demonstrating his freedom, his ability to live according to principle rather than mere inclination. Think about what it takes to write something like the Critique of Pure Reason. Not just the intellectual capacity, though that is certainly required, but also the patience to work through endless details, to trace out the implications of every assumption, to consider objections and formulate responses, to revise and refine and polish until every word is precisely chosen. Think about spending a decade thinking about a single set of problems before even beginning to write, then spending months in intensive labor to get the words on paper. This is not something that can be done in spare moments stolen from a busy life of other commitments. It requires the kind of sustained, focused attention that only a carefully structured, highly disciplined existence can provide. So perhaps we should see Kant's clockwork routine not as a limitation but as an enabling condition, as the necessary framework that made his philosophical achievements possible. The regularity of his external life supported the extraordinary richness of his internal life. The narrowness of his geographical horizons was compensated by the breadth of his intellectual horizons. He may never have seen the ocean, but he thought deeply about the nature of space and time. He may never have experienced romantic love, but he developed a sophisticated theory of moral agency and human dignity. He may never have left Königsberg, but his ideas traveled around the world. Consider the global problems we face today: climate change, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, economic inequality, the spread of misinformation, the erosion of democratic norms. None of these problems can be solved through blind adherence to tradition or unquestioning acceptance of authority. They require precisely the kind of rational, critical, collaborative inquiry that Kant championed. They demand that we think for ourselves while also recognizing our obligations to others, that we use our reason while also acknowledging its limits, that we dare to know while remaining humble about what we can achieve. Kant's vision of perpetual peace, sketched out in that brief essay written in 1795, seems more relevant than ever. His proposal for a federation of republican states, his argument for cosmopolitan right, his insistence that wars can be ended through law rather than merely suspended through temporary truces. These ideas helped inspire the creation of international institutions that, for all their flaws and limitations, have helped to prevent the outbreak of another world war and have established frameworks for addressing global challenges. Similarly, Kant's moral philosophy, with its emphasis on human dignity and the categorical imperative, provides resources for thinking about contemporary ethical challenges. How should we respond to refugees fleeing violence and oppression? Kant's principle of universal hospitality, his insistence on treating every person as an end in themselves, suggests that we have obligations that extend beyond our own national borders. What are the ethics of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons systems? Kant's distinction between treating beings as mere means versus treating them as ends in themselves offers a framework for thinking about these questions. Immanuel Kant's journey from the leather-scented workshop of his father to the heights of philosophical achievement, from the boy who watched stars with his mother to the sage whose thoughts about the nature of knowledge and morality would reshape human civilization, is a testament to the power of ideas and the potential of dedicated human thought. His life reminds us that significance is not measured in miles traveled or wealth accumulated but in depth of understanding and quality of contribution to human knowledge and welfare. The philosopher is gone, but the philosophy endures. And somewhere, in every lecture hall where students grapple with the critique of pure reason, in every courtroom where human rights are defended, in every moment when someone chooses to act from duty rather than mere inclination, in every effort to build a more just and peaceful world, the spirit of Immanuel Kant, the clockwork philosopher who dared to think, who insisted that we are more than mere natural objects, who believed that reason could illuminate the darkness, continues its work. Let us dare to know as Kant urged. Let us have the courage to use our own understanding, to think for ourselves while also listening to and learning from others. Let us recognize in every person the same capacity for rational autonomy that Kant celebrated, treating them as ends in themselves rather than mere means to our purposes. Let us work toward the kind of world that Kant envisioned, a world of perpetual peace, of enlightened citizens, of institutions structured around principles of right rather than mere power. The starry heavens above us remind us of the vast, orderly universe that science seeks to understand. The moral law within us reminds us of our capacity for freedom and our obligations to one another. Between these two infinities, the infinite vastness of space and time, the infinite depth of moral consciousness, we make our lives, navigating by reason and guided by duty, seeking truth and striving for goodness. This is the legacy of Immanuel Kant, the man who never left home but changed the world.